Hi everyone. This is the answer, I guess, key in video form for the homework that I assigned in your last lesson. So you'll recall in our last lesson we talked a little bit about the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. We introduced how it worked. We talked about what those curves represent, and then we also talked a little bit about various hypothetical economies or economic situations your economy might face at different periods of time. What I'm going to do here is I'm just going to go through some of the answers to that work, and if you have any questions, of course, feel free to email me. I'll happily try to provide some kind of supplementary response. The first question asks you, how are aggregate demand and aggregate supply similar to the microeconomic concepts of demand and supply? Well, I've put together a little graph here which can just sort of go over aggregate demand, aggregate supply. As you'll see, they are somewhat similar to the micro concepts of supply and demand in that they do, at their equilibrium, first and foremost, establish an equilibrium point for your economy. You'll notice where the aggregate demand curve intersects with the aggregate supply, that establishes a quantity, which in this particular case is a national quantity, so we call that Y, or Y representing GDP. You can put GDP if you want as well. And then we also have a level of prices. Now, prices can't obviously be individual because we're looking more at price level. But if you were to label your graph, and I haven't done so, but I probably should have, then you can come across, and at the intersection point, you have a certain level of prices that exist at that particular time. The model is also similar in the sense that aggregate demand slopes downwards, aggregate supply more or less slopes upwards. Other than that, I wouldn't really get into too much detail for that question. I think those are sort of the general ideas they wanted you to cover. Second question, a little bit more critical. It asks, what are the components of aggregate demand? I've put them down at the bottom here, and you can see that with, sorry, it's hard to see, with the equation that I've put on the chart. You'll notice that aggregate demand is equal to C, which is consumer spending, I, which is investment, spending by businesses on infrastructure, inventory, and other things that will allow for future growth, G, which is government spending, and then finally X, which is exports. And then we have subtraction factor of imports, because if any of those first four categories represented money going to another country, then it's not really part of our own, I guess, net wealth. It would actually be a part of another country's GDP. And so there has to be that correction factor. So that's pretty much the answer to question number two. It's an important idea because often when you're looking at an economy and you're looking at where your economy is, and you can see in this particular picture, we're right there sort of at a full employment position, which would be ideal. Generally, the majority of policy involves trying to manipulate and move that aggregate demand curve, which is much easier to move through policy means. And trying to move that curve essentially means not just trying to move the curve, but trying to change the variables that create the level of that curve. If you want the curve to move towards the right, this direction, then you would try to increase those variables. Whereas if you wanted to have a slowdown in your economy, then of course in those situations you would tend to want to reduce those variables and move the other direction. Okay, so that's questions number 1 and 2. Question number 3 asks, why is the aggregate supply curve elastic at low outputs and then inelastic at high levels of output? I'm going to pull back that graph because I actually will need it again. We went through that as well. The reason why you tend to have a fairly elastic curve in the bottom portions is that when you're at an economy that's below YFE, which is there, I keep covering it up, but that's the full employment level, right where the curve starts to pull upwards, what tends to happen, I'm going to get a better graph here, what tends to happen in those instances is that during that range you have unemployed resources within your economy up and until full employment. And when you have unemployed resources in that stretch, those people as workers, or those people who own land, or those people who own materials, they don't really, when they're selling those resources, have a lot of opportunity to bid up their price. In fact, they tend to take the going price as is. And so typically speaking, there's not really a lot of room for inflation, at least internally, because the pressures that create inflation, over demand, shortage of supply, they're just not there. What happens though is that when your economy gets to a point where it hits full employment, you've essentially got all of the people who want to work within your economy working. Most of the resources that people want to distribute in terms of materials and other things are being used. And so at that particular point, if you want to get those people working more that are already working, or maybe encourage people who've chosen not to work, or in some other means get effort into the economy that wasn't there, you're probably going to have to give more incentive. And that typically will mean that prices will start to increase. And of course, you'll have inflation. The other dilemma, and you can see this as you start to see the curve become more horizontal, is that while you can get some growth beyond full employment, it's not a hard cap on the economy. There's a little bit of room before you hit capacity. What you will start to find is that even if you pay people more money, there's really only so far that they can actually go before eventually there's just a cap on what they can do. Okay, and so essentially you will hit a hard cap where the amount of resources and the effectiveness with which you use your resources has been maximized for current circumstances, and that would represent this horizontal line where if for whatever reason you tried to pour money into that economy that was already moving at its maximum, it would simply keep giving you what it was giving because there's not enough real resources there for the economy and the GDP to increase beyond that point. The last question asks you about a recessionary gap. I'll talk about that a little bit when I go through the three graphs because, of course, that was the second part of the homework, and it just makes more sense to do that. So the second part of your homework had asked you to draw a couple of different graphs and show what the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model would look like in these different situations. The first one, which you can see here, is the first required graph, which is an inflationary gap. The key idea, which you can see in the graph that I've drawn, is that the aggregate supply curve, and I apologize, the S has been a little bit erased there, but that should say AS there. It is established in a way that when aggregate demand is coming through, it's actually beyond the point of full employment. You'll notice full employment is where the aggregate supply starts to see that rapid upward slope and moving towards being fairly horizontal. If you push past full employment, what will happen is that you'll end up in that range. It's not a bad thing from the perspective of output. Okay, in fact, I didn't label here, but you could, if you wanted to go down there and label that line kind of coming down as Y0, you could. That's fine. You've got a lot of money in your economy. You've got a lot of jobs. The challenge is that you're starting to push your economy beyond what it's usually capable of. And it's probably creating A, inflationary impacts, but B, potentially the risk of a bit of a bubble in the sense that the economy may be growing so quickly that the growth is limited and the spending is actually not reflected in terms of real returns. It's a danger because, as you've seen throughout history, when the economy does overheat, oftentimes the herd mindset of the population starts to take over. People may start to spend unwisely. They may tend to bid up prices for things that, as you can see, are not really worth it in terms of real return. And the potential is that if that bubble bursts, not only may your aggregate demand start moving backwards, but in fact it may overshoot that target of just going back to a normal equilibrium, but in fact push yourself further backwards or push the economy further backwards into a recession. So this would actually be a position which would not be ideal. Typically speaking, a government would be wise to try to find means of not necessarily forcing the AD down really quickly because that's risky, but maybe kind of taking that heat. Let's think it's like a stove, and the stove is perhaps at 8 or 9. Turn it down a notch or two to 6 or 7. Slow the growth a little bit so that hopefully it moves closer to a more ideal spot of full employment where there's at least a little bit less irrational behavior and a little bit less risk. The second position that I'd ask you to draw, and this will also answer question number 4 from the homework, is with regards to a recessionary gap. Recession looks like this, and you can see the key thing in the diagram is that when you look at your employment picture, you want to be here at the YFE. That's the goal, right here. But you're actually performing well below. Aggregate demand, as you can see, is much below that point. The result is that while inflation is not really a concern, typically speaking, unless it's some external factor, you're not going to have a lot of demand. Inflation will actually generally be pretty low in a major recession. What you will see is you will see a lack of output, job sort of concerns, and really a goal of trying to get rid of that by trying to push the aggregate demand in this particular direction to the right so that obviously things will get better. No government would be thrilled with this particular picture. This is obviously a concern whenever it occurs, especially the deeper and further backwards towards the left that the aggregate demand falls. The final graph that you were supposed to look at was full employment. This is the picture of a model economy. This is really where your government wants things to be. And in this particular situation, you have aggregate demand coming through aggregate supply exactly at that sort of point where you're starting to see the increase in slope of full employment. It happens. Usually, you're lucky that you kind of the economy's been managed well enough that it gets to that point, or just good circumstances. Usually, a combination of those two things. The dilemma is that, especially in terms of aggregate demand, that curve is constantly moving backwards and forwards due to factors on its own. You can't control all consumption, investment, exports, imports, and so what will end up happening is that you'll often be there, feel confident as a government, and then unfortunately things may degrade. To ask about the most recent situation, we can talk about that. Probably up until a couple of maybe even a week ago, this was fairly close to the picture for the Canadian economy. We've been in good shape. People were feeling pretty good about things. The coronavirus impact is only just starting to become an impact, but obviously it's a dramatic one. We won't see the full results and be able to really analyze for a couple of months or so, but I think almost certainly, and you're going to see this here, we've moved very, very rapidly, much more rapidly than you would normally do so, into a recessionary gap. The goal, of course, for the government is that they won't want us to be there. They want to try to prevent this as much as possible. And so a huge amount of what's happening in terms of policy, I'm going to actually make a whole video and devote a day just to talking about that. A huge amount of the policy right now is emergency measures designed to try to counteract that decline of the aggregate demand and try to push backwards against that, even though the natural tendency is to go this way. So the natural forces in the coronavirus are pushing aggregate demand this direction. The government is trying to counteract by pushing back against that. They're kind of pushing against a bit of a tsunami, so they're not going to be able to push it all the way they want. But the hope is that even if those efforts don't necessarily stop the downward direction, they at least stall it enough that the consequences are less than they would have been otherwise. So hopefully you've enjoyed this. As I said, if you have any questions, let me know. Yeah, okay, we'll move on to the next lesson in a few minutes.